going to press. Welcome to IAB Canada's Diverse Voices Across Canada discussion. And for those of you that this applies, happy Diwali. Brought to you by our DEI Working Group, we intend on delving into the topic of diversity within diversity, a theme that you'll likely hear interwoven throughout the next hour. For those of you dialing in from the West Coast, I promise not to do this to you again. Jagdeesh, you included. And for those of you dialed in, thank you for being part of this important discussion. What a pleasure to have you here. Before I introduce our first guest speakers, I wanted to take a moment to thank our incredible elite sponsors for 2022. In alphabetical order, Amazon Ads, Google, Index Exchange, Quantcast, Samsung Ads, and the Globe and Mail. Thank you for your ongoing support today and throughout the entire year. With that, please help me in welcoming Mike Fragomeni, Director of Strategic Insights, along with Rahul Sethi, VP of Insights and Marketing at Vividata. Mike and Rahul will be taking industry through their recent findings from their multicultural study, where we focus on the voices of different groups. So please take things away.
Thank you. I'm just going to share my screen here.
Please do.
You can see my thank you notes to Laura and team, which I'm going to say now. So yeah, thank you, Laura and the team at IAB Canada for organizing this important event. Yeah, my name is Rahul Sethi, and I'm joined by my colleague Mike Fragomeni, and we're both from Vividata, and we'll both be going back and forth kind of throughout this presentation. So I'll start with the intro, Mike will jump in, and I'll jump back in later on. If you don't know too much about, oh wait, am I sharing full screen?
You aren't. No, if you wanted to put that into presentation mode, yeah.
Do I do that? Thank you.
No problem.
Sorry about that. This is always the tricky part.
That's okay. And we can see your slides, Rahul.
Oh gosh.
If you, yeah, at the very bottom, sorry, I just lost my, there we go. At the very bottom, you'll see right beside the Zoom feature at the very on the right-hand side on the ribbon,
yeah,
you'll see the icon that is right beside the negative. Yeah,
sorry.
Press that guy.
This one. No. Gosh. Sorry, everybody. Trying to figure this out here.
Sorry, I've just lost my view here.
Let's try this one more time. There we go. Is that right?
We see it. Yes, you are in presentation. Yep.
Awesome. So before we get into the data, just a quick background or intro to Vividata. So if you haven't heard of us, we are the leading source for cross-media and consumer data and insights for many of Canada's and the world's most successful brands. We're mostly known for our national syndicated study, the SCC, Study of the Canadian Consumer, which is a high-quality, nationally representative single-source database for in-depth consumer insights and audience intelligence. And a lot of other research that we do is like niche research, like multicultural groups in Canada. We have a cannabis study, sports and esports study. And in many cases, what we do is with this flagship study and those niche studies, we fuse results back to the SCC to expand analysis on any topic that we cover. So the results we're sharing today are from our recent SCC Multicultural Study, SCC standing for that Study of the Canadian Consumer, which was fielded as an online survey just this summer between June and July. The study it's like hot off the press, and all the results that we'll be sharing today are unweighted results. So it's actually, we're working on this database as we speak. And following the release of the 2021 census data, which is actually tomorrow, perfect timing, the study will be weighted to the Canadian population by ethnic group, fused to our study of the Canadian consumer for expanded insights and analysis. And then it'll be available for purchase as a syndicated database or custom reports for anyone who's interested in very specific information from this database, from this data set. So the study collected data from 3 of the largest multicultural groups in Canada, which are Black, Chinese, and South Asian Canadians currently. We also intended to field a study among the Indigenous community in Canada. That was one of our goals as well. However, after speaking to experts in the industry, including someone of Indigenous descent, we realized we could not sufficiently cover Indigenous groups as part of another study with other groups, and we would require a dedicated study based on a number of factors I won't go into today. So this study focuses on, Black, Chinese, and South Asian Canadians, and how they feel about advertising, demographic information, all kinds of good stuff. But the information that we go through today is by no means exhaustive of what this database has collected. So these are some top line findings, and again, unweighted currently, and then they'll be weighted post census release. So with that background, I'll hand it off to Mike, and we'll jump back in later in this presentation. Mike?
Thanks, Rahul. Yeah, I'm just going to take you through a few slides that just kind of talks about the high-level demographic information that we pulled for these 3 particular communities. So looking at each community of respondents and where they live within Canada, Ontario is by far the region of choice. 57% of Black Canadians, for example, live in Ontario, along with nearly half of Chinese Canadians and over 61% of respondents who identify as South Asian Canadians. Other than Ontario, just over 1 in 5 Black Canadians live in Quebec, compared to just 5% of Chinese and 6% of South Asian Canadians, while over 1 in 3 Chinese Canadians live in BC. Other than Ontario, the prairies and the Atlantic provinces have the most even distributions of Black, Chinese, and South Asian Canadians. However, these diverse communities are the least likely to live in the Atlantic provinces. While Black Canadians in general tend to be equally of African or Caribbean descent, we've seen a pretty dramatic shift in recent years with new Black Canadians, those who have arrived within Canada in the last 5 years. They're being twice as likely to have immigrated from Africa rather than the Caribbean. For Chinese Canadians, Hong Kong has primarily been the region of origin, and that's especially the case with new Chinese Canadians, with nearly 2 in 3 who've come within the last 5 years arriving from Hong Kong and just 1 in 5 arriving from mainland China. India continues to be the primary country of origin for South Asian Canadians, especially over the past 5 years, with over 75% of South Asian Canadians arriving from India, compared to other countries like Pakistan, Sri Lanka, or Bangladesh. In terms of languages most often spoken at home, respondents who identified as Black Canadians show the least amount of variation, with close to 9 in 10 speaking Canada's 2 national languages of English or French. There's a little bit more variation with the Chinese Canadians. 45% of Chinese Canadians speak English at home. However, both Cantonese and Mandarin are spoken in over half the homes of Chinese Canadians, with Cantonese being slightly more spoken than Mandarin. Compared to both Black and Chinese Canadians, South Asians show the greatest variation in languages, with just over 1 in 4 speaking English. Hindi or Punjabi are spoken by 40% of respondents, and 35% speak other languages like Urdu, Tamil, or Bengali. When looking at the routes established by diverse Canadians, Chinese Canadians were the most likely to have been born in Canada or have lived in Canada for at least 11 or more years. On the opposite end of the spectrum, respondents that identified as South Asian were the most likely to be newer Canadians, with over half arriving within the last 10 years, and just 1 in 5 being born in Canada. Black Canadians sit between the 2 other communities, having a significant group with long established roots, but also strong 25% of respondents that said they arrived within the past 5 years. Like we've seen from past studies, diverse Canadians skew far younger than the average Canadian population overall. Generally, there's fairly an even split between Canadians that are, in general, that are under 50 versus those that are 50 and up. You see that top line bar at the top there with 27% under 35, 23% 35 to 49, 26% 50 to 64, and 24% being 65 up. It's generally an older population. Black, Chinese, and South Asian Canadians, however, are all far younger communities, with up to 90% of respondents that identified as Black Canadians, for example, being under the age of 50. So we're seeing that huge skew towards being younger. Rahul, back to you.
Thanks, Mike. And so lots of diversity within diversity is really what we're seeing here. So you have, of course, different ethnic groups, but within those ethnic groups, as Mike pointed out, you see diversity in terms of where they're coming from, diversity in terms of languages, and that's also important to kind of remember as we're marketing and trying to engage these different groups. And if we look at a statement like this, a majority of Black, Chinese, and South Asian Canadians agree, I don't see people like me presented enough in ads. This is compared to less than half of all Canadians, so 48%, half of all Canadians aged 18 plus, which is also comprised of multicultural groups that sit in that 48%, right? So if we look at the same statement also against newcomers, not shown on this slide, but if we were to look at the same statement against newcomers to Canada, as Mike pointed out, those who arrived within the past 5 years, we would see that there's an even stronger feeling of not feeling presented in ads. And it's just a simple indication of the need for that greater diversity and inclusion. And of course, we have more on this story coming up in a second as well. So some more opinions and voices from Canadians and diverse Canadians. And greater diversity and inclusion in advertising is not only like a better practice for the sake of diversity and inclusion, but it's good marketing as well. So yeah, we want diversity, we want inclusion just because it's a good thing to do. But as I said, like it also is good as a marketing practice that will drive results. A majority of Black and South Asian Canadians and a significant proportion of Chinese Canadians agree I'm more likely to remember brands that have ads with people of my own of my own culture. On top of that, so we want definitely, you have that engagement, you have that greater connection when you have these ethnic groups presented in ads, if you're trying to reach out to these ethnic groups. But at the same time, the need for more diversity and inclusion in advertising also extends to diversity in the individuals providing the service, or let's say those at the table. As a significant proportion of all three groups also agree, I feel more comfortable using professionals for various services that are of my own culture and speak my native language. So again, a great way to connect with these diverse communities, and is not only through having them presented in ads, but also again, having people of these groups at the table or providing that service that you're delivering. And there's always, of course, like nerves, fear of if there's a cultural issue for an ethnic group that's currently a hot topic or in the news right now as a brand. I mean, I can imagine there's always that hesitation of like, do we say something? Don't we say something? Especially if we don't have someone, again, from that ethnic group at the table. And when we look at this statement, I look favorably upon a brand that makes a stance on a cultural issue, example like Black Lives Matter. Especially among Black and South Asian Canadians, you see that a majority agree, and a significant proportion of Chinese Canadians as well, a third agree with that statement, right? So if we're a brand, we're considering, should I say something on this cultural issue or so on, amongst the majority of at least Black and South Asian Canadians and other groups that we haven't currently measured are likely to be in favor of brands that say something, right? Of course, it's not only about what you say, but the tone of how you say it as well. And we'll leave that to the creatives. So let's go a little bit further into opinion and also talk about events. And I'm going to show you kind of a breakout of top events by ethnic groups in a second. But just to kind of give you a mindset, I mean, before the event started, we were talking about Diwali. Diwali was yesterday, and lots of people celebrating across the country. And you see that reflected even in something like this statement, where, you know, a majority of all three groups agreed participating in cultural activities and events gives me a sense of belonging. I mean, these are individuals that are pretty much like, you know, far removed from their country of origin or their culture. And so having these practices here, and I mean, I can speak to that as a South Asian as well, having these practices here, you know, celebrating these events, like going all out in some cases, it means a lot to do that with your community, and especially if a brand connects at that time as well. Which leads to the next statement and this, the opinion of these different groups amongst this statement. I'm more likely to remember promotional offers related to and during festivals, right? So you're already in this, and that's especially amongst the South Asian group at 60%, and significant proportion for Black and Chinese Canadians as well. So, you know, if we're marketing to different groups during festivals and cultural events, it is great timing, right? They're already celebrating, you know, there's positive attitude. And when a brand kind of reaches out, you feel like they're also trying to be a part of that community. And again, also speaking not only from the research that we see, but also from experience. And also you have a significant proportion agreeing, not the majority, but a significant proportion agreeing of each segment to the following statement as well. I'm more likely to use or begin using brands that have festival themed products. You know, there's a number of different brands out there. And, you know, speaking about, for example, Diwali, since it was just yesterday, you have Purdy's chocolates that are now like a Diwali themed packaging. You know, it looks like a diya. They got a greeting on the top, and something even like for ourselves, our family, that's something that we went to then rather than traditional Indian sweets, we're like, hey, let's get Purdy's chocolates for everyone. And it was a cool way to celebrate your background and your ethnicity, but also kind of in a modern way. So there's a lot of interesting things going on there with different ethnic communities. And when a brand does something like this, like a promotional offer or a themed product around an event. But that being said, one thing we really wanted to highlight, and this visual here kind of shows, you know, you have Black Canadians on the far left, Chinese Canadians in the middle, South Asian on the right, and the top 5 cultural events that they reported celebrating, you know, among Black Canadians, top 5, you know, Christmas, Easter, Thanksgiving, Black History Month jumps up there as well as Halloween. So a lot of already kind of Western, you know, quote unquote, Western events. Among Chinese Canadians, by far, Lunar New Year #1 at 72%. But what's really interesting amongst the Chinese and South Asian Canadians is you see Christmas coming and taking that sitting in the top 2 spot, right? So we're not only celebrating cultural festivals, you know, our events, but we're also celebrating these Western events, and Christmas is huge even amongst our family. So, you know, you see that there's also an opportunity to not only reach out to these groups during times of their cultural festivals, but we're also celebrating these Western events. So it's an opportunity to reach out to us at this time as well. You know, why not show Chinese Canadians in a Christmas ad, or South Asian Canadians or Black Canadians in a Christmas ad, right? There's huge opportunity. Again, we're celebrating along with the rest of the country for the most part as well. And also events like Thanksgiving, Halloween, Easter, etc. And it's a way to belong in this new environment that we're in as well. But to take that a little bit further, you know, yeah, it's a great opportunity to target and market to ethnic groups during their times of celebrations and festivals. But, you know, we can't forget that everyone's in the market for different things throughout the year, right? Like I'm not only, you know, I'm South Asian, I'm not only shopping for a car during Diwali, like I'm shopping for a car. When I'm shopping for a car, it's not tied to a festival, right? Or I'm not even going for myself specifically, I'm buying chocolates outside of Diwali as well, not only during Diwali time. And if we look at certain kind of key consumer categories, and this visual kind of compares the different ethnic groups, Black, Chinese, and South Asian Canadians, to the average Canadian, which is the gray bar, the dark blue circle, which is Black Canadians, that diamond, which is Chinese Canadians, and the red triangle, which is South Asian Canadians. And if we look at their propensity or intention to buy the following items in the next 12 months, like, buy real estate or change their bank or buy furniture or home accessories, major appliances, or be in the market for a vehicle, you see that it's really the multicultural groups that are more likely to do so than the average Canadian within the next year, right? So, we want to think beyond festivals and events and actually think about, marketing to different groups year round. And a lot of the reason why, they over-index amongst all of these different items is, a lot of these groups are also newcomers, right? A significant proportion of them, as we saw with what Mike shared before in the presentation. So a lot of them are setting up their household, they're setting up their lives here. So they're in the market for key items. So we don't want to ignore them and forget that as well and only market to them during times of celebration, but be conscious of and aware of that they're really setting up their homes and their lives here in the market for a number of different things. And even those that are not new but established are also in the market for different products and services. So we want to keep that in mind. So just to wrap up quickly, some final thoughts. We want to keep in mind that there is diversity within diversity, right? Of course, as a country, we're a very diverse country itself. But even if you look at, Black Canadians, Chinese Canadians, South Asian Canadians, there's an element of diversity within that diversity in terms of place of origin, what languages they speak, and so on. As I just said, multicultural groups are in market year round, not just during cultural events. So while that's great to connect with multicultural groups, and we appreciate it a lot, and I'm saying that from my experience, not speaking on behalf of everyone, but it's a great kind of experience to see a brand celebrating Diwali with you and so on. I'm also in the market for items year round, so don't forget about multicultural groups year round. And as we saw before, with regards to certain groups, again, feeling like they aren't presented enough in advertising, they don't see enough of themselves in ads and so on, we are also waiting to be spoken to. So as marketers, we can take that opportunity. And just kind of like a final wrap up of the study itself. So as I mentioned, these current findings that we shared today are unweighted and percentages of the sample for this study. Census data is coming out tomorrow, and we're actually going to start weighting these results to the Canadian census. So you have projected numbers for the population and can get detailed information on things like what we shared today, languages spoken, place of origin, festivals they celebrate, detailed purchasing and media behavior, and a lot more. And if you're interested, please feel free to reach out. And we'll close off our portion of today's event. Thank you so much.
Rahul, Mike, thank you both very, very much. This is really important research and insight. So thank you very much for sharing some of the information contained with the study overall with us today. This sense of belonging is really sticking in conjunction to, though, always being on as well. And so trying to find that balance. I want to delve into that a little bit further. Again, thank you, Rahul, Mike. And let's delve into this concept a little bit further. Please help me in welcoming a little cozy fireside alongside of Jagdeesh Mann, president at Sunflower Media. And Jagdeesh is going to sit down with IAB Canada's DEI chair, Maz Tannir. Maz, I'm going to let you take things away.
Thanks, Laura. Thanks, Mike and Rahul. Always great to hear all the great research and information you have. Jagdeesh, hi, Jagdeesh. I didn't even
Nice to see you.
Let's dive into this because there's a lot of great data that was presented earlier. You're very much closer to the multicultural marketing world. The number that they showed earlier, that almost 60% of the population don't see people like them in marketing messages and advertising. What steps are you taking with your clients or with the brands that you are currently representing to try to change that number around?
I think one of the first things is before we even go into the actual, issue of actually being represented in the actual media and the actual creative is first, I guess, recognizing that there is a market. Surprisingly, there are still brands out there and agencies that still don't fully understand the scope and the size of the markets that we're dealing with. To it, let me give you an example. We were talking off stage just before this podcast began about Diwali, and it's been mentioned a couple of times since then. And so last night I was also at a Diwali event. I was at a Sikh temple here in the Fraser Valley. And a couple of things struck me. One was to Rahul and Mike's point about diversity within diversity. This was a Sikh event from a Sikh temple, and there was thousands of people there. The parking lot was jammed. There was a great deal of traffic, even just trying to get into the temple. But it struck me that the way Diwali, what we see as a sort of universal, sort of overarching event from a Canadian perspective, is quite different within different South Asian groups. So, the way Sikhs would celebrate Diwali is different from the way people who are of a Hindu faith would celebrate Diwali, which is different from the way people of a South Indian background would celebrate Diwali, which is different from the way people of a Sri Lankan background would celebrate Diwali. And so, having, first of all, speaking to that diversity within diversity point, it's very difficult actually to see that unless you are engaged inside of these communities. And the second point, which was, as I mentioned earlier, was just the sheer magnitude of the event. There was thousands and thousands of people at this one particular temple in this suburban area of the Fraser Valley. And like it, there was probably a dozen other Hindu and Sikh temples that also were attracting that same amount of traffic. And the point about this was that unless you are engaged and actively involved in these communities, you're not going to know. And in my particular case, I have children, I have very young children who happen to attend Punjabi language school at one of these temples. And so therefore I went. Otherwise, I'm not necessarily going to go, but let's say because of that particular reason, I was kind of pulled into that sort of environment. And we work in a very mainstream type of setting. My office is in downtown Vancouver, and I'm sure most of my colleagues here also work in what we would call, quote unquote, a mainstream type of setting. And unless you're actively involved in these diverse communities at that very grassroots level, you're not going to really understand the magnitude and the sheer size of these communities. And you're also not going to understand the vitality. Like, these are really engaged, active communities within our silos. And this is unfortunate, sort of part of the Canadian experience, that we kind of live in these sort of siloed type of environments. But we're not going to really necessarily understand like the magnitude, and we're not going to understand the internal conversations that are happening in these communities if we're not actively engaging. And therefore, speaking to our, your earlier point or your question about representation in ads, I would say that before there's even an issue of being represented in creative, I think there has to be representation at the actual table at these different levels of conversations that brands and agencies are having about, first of all, recognizing that there is a market, and secondly, how do we engage with these communities? What do we say? And what do we omit? Like, what do we not say in order to actually activate, or capture some of that spirit or energy, let's say of a Diwali, or let's say of a Chinese New Year, to further our reach for our brands with these communities.
Great point. I'm first generation immigrant here. I moved here with my family a few years ago. And you're very right about the silos. So as immigrants, we come and we kind of stick to our own as much as possible. One thing I have noticed over time, though, is, and Rahul and Mike brought it up earlier, is the idea of the festivals being the gateway to talking to the immigrant community. Because for me, I will participate in our family is multicultural, so we'll participate in Diwali as well. But we're also looking for products and services. And as first generation, and the numbers have just come out not long ago from the Canadian government about how many new families they plan to bring into Canada over the next 10 or so years. The number's quite staggering. It's an incredible number, which means a whole new phase of changing the products that you were potentially used to back home and starting to use local products or going to new stores or, new experiences. So let's talk a little bit about these festivals. Do you, from your agency standpoint, see that festivals are the peak of when people are going to start spending towards these communities? Or are you starting to see it a bit more equal out in terms of when they want to go after?
Yeah, that's a good question, actually. And it's a question that we've encountered a few times. And I would agree with what I think Rahul was getting at earlier, that people with a South Asian background, or let's say the Chinese background during Chinese New Year, likewise South Asian during Diwali, are not necessarily going to make every single expenditure, that every single major big ticket purchase of the year during that single 1 week or 2 week window. And while I think it's certainly it's great. I think the communities welcome the engagement from brands during these festive windows. It's there's 50 other weeks in the year which are also, I think, just as relevant, maybe not as auspicious, but they're still just as relevant when it comes to consumer or consumption. And I think getting the message right, like during I'll give you a couple of examples here in Vancouver. Like Rahul was speaking to Purdy's as creating a very special Diwali chocolate package, and I think that's great. I think that's kind of interesting because it speaks to the Canadian Diwali experience. And like I mentioned earlier, there's multiple types of Diwali. But a couple of examples here in Vancouver, the Vancouver Canucks, I think just last night, or maybe the night before, introduced their Diwali jerseys. And I thought it was a really nice gesture. It was, I think it was a really great way of reaching out to a very large South Asian community here in the Lower Mainland. They made some other content around it. The jerseys look great. And just like during Chinese New Year, like they're sort of special jerseys at that time, I think they're really great collector items. And I think that's an example of a product, probably like Purdy's, which has been done really well. Or an example of a Diwali tie-up, which is done really well. Another example, which is a client of ours, and I'm not going to reveal the name, is that they're a recycling company, and to their they're trying their best, obviously, and they kind of keep insisting, despite our better efforts to tell them otherwise, to not necessarily tie electronics recycling with Diwali, because there really isn't an obvious mashup there. But yet they keep insisting on it, and we keep working with the client. But so it's, for us, it's a bit of a reach to say that you should recycle your electronics and your computers and your old devices only during this one particular window or the year. But so it's an example where maybe that's a little bit more sort of ham-fisted. But
right. Before we pass it back to Laura, I do want to touch on something that's quite important, and I think it'll help a lot of the audience that's here today, is having that voice at the table when you're making these types of decisions, whether it was an agency, a consultant, a partner, ideally people that are employed by your organization. Are you seeing that change in terms of staffing for multicultural marketing? Because again, we've seen some terrible examples, and we don't want to get into that today. But instances like the Canucks jersey that you were referring to, it's very likely they had some people that were advising them what was the best thing to be doing in terms of the branding, the colors, the timing, and so on.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Like the Canucks actually had a local South Asian artist who's well established, and she did a fantastic job on the graphics with those jerseys. But your point is absolutely critical. That there has to be people who can straddle or speak to the experiences from these diverse communities. They have to be at the table, because otherwise, if they're not at the table, you're going to miss so much of the emotional context and the backstory, which your brands could really leverage if they understood. And I'll give you a quick example. I know we're probably running out of time, but my mother, she was a first generation immigrant, and she came like a number of years ago. And back when we were growing up in our small little speck of a small Canadian small mill town in the middle of nowhere, she was probably one of the only people in that city. Every Diwali would light her clay lamps, and she would put the mustard oil in, and she would light the wick, and it'd be running all night. And it was one of those things as kids when we were growing up, was one of the really interesting experiences that we saw. There was like this whole ceremony around how she did this, pouring in the oil, lighting the wick, leaving it out all night. We would actually even get up in the middle of the night and we would see the lamp still burning on the table. It was just such a really special, unique occasion. And there's a lot of rich emotional context and content in that experience, which if brands understood, and if there was somebody at the table who could convey that whole ceremony and how solemn that whole occasion was, they could find a way to speak to it to their advantage. But because oftentimes there isn't someone at the table, they're not able to do so.
And I think that's one of the biggest takeaways, Laura. And I see you've opened up your camera, so. But I think that's one of the key takeaways, really, is having that voice at the table, making sure that brands, marketers, companies, we do this a lot at our agency as well. We're just making sure that the inclusivity of the multicultural aspect is brought to the table for these bigger conversations too.
Yeah, like I said, I think the magic happens once you capture the emotional content of the actual event and understand it and align with it, and then that's when you're really making gains.
Jagdeesh, it's always a pleasure chatting to you, my friend.
Yeah, you too, Maz. Good to catch up.
Thank you both. I was trying to add in as you were kind of taking us through in the audience through some of your key talking points. So if I've missed any, please feel free to add it in. I've just been putting them into the chat because I think that there's relevance in a lot of what's being discussed. So thank you both very much for joining us today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Last but not least, I would like to introduce our esteemed panel to delve into some of that's already been discussed: diversity within diversity, having the right talent at the table. So please help me in welcoming in alphabetical order: Megha, Senior Legal Counsel, Privacy and Compliance at Sharethrough; Tara, Diversity, Equity and Inclusion Program Manager at Google Canada, along with Nikki Davis, Executive Director, Equity and Inclusion at CBC. And this panel is going to be moderated by Karim, VP Digital and Emerging Media at Active International. Karim, I think you might actually want to kick things off with a land acknowledgement. So I'm going to pass things over to you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Yes, before we continue, if I may, I know we have people here from across Canada. IAB's offices are in Toronto. So if I may do a land acknowledgement for Toronto. We acknowledge the land we are meeting on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. And we acknowledge that Toronto was covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. Thank you, everyone, for joining me today on this panel. Megha, Nikki, Tara, and do we have Trevor here? I can't seem to see.
No, you have Tara.
Okay.
It's Tara, yeah.
All right, excellent, Thank you. Well, listen, let's get right into it. And Nikki, let's start off with you. And please, everyone, chime in as well. Let's start on a topic of diversity within diversity. We understand that the right talent is part of the planning process, part of the creative process, like we've talked a little bit about today already. Nick, have you seen an improvement with who is part of this process? And how can we encourage more of it? It's probably not perfect.
It's the presentation that was made at the beginning with the deck from the advertising people around looking at the diversity within diversity and talking about how important it is to have representation at the table. That the point that Jagdeesh made, and I would just say that as it changed, I think it's changed over the years. I think when you take a look at least in my world, in the media world, for sure, there's an attempt to be more inclusive and making sure that we have better representation. Where we have failed, in our world is that it's not at the decision-making table. And the reason why it's important for me that it is at that space, and I mean, I think Jagdeesh illuminated it a little bit well, talking about capturing the emotion and capturing the kind of the intricacies of various communities, is if you have no one at the decision-making table who's even from those communities, and then how do you actually understand and surface those things, right? And the reason why it's important to me, like, so I'll give you my example. So at my leadership table at CBC, where I'm part of the leadership team, I'm one of only 2 people who are from an equity deserving group, and a whole group, right? It's okay. 2 years ago we had none, so we've increased manyfold, right? And of the 2 of us who were there at that table, I'm a Black man, she's a Black woman, but we actually come from different parts of the Black community, and we have our own ideas around how we experience our community in completely different ways. I'm West Indian. She's not. She's from the East Coast, and from a long line of Canadians come from there. We experience our Blackness differently, but we also, though, but if I'm not at the table, I know that we're not a monolith, the Black community. So I can actually make choices and decisions understanding that. But if nobody's at the table and we're trying to make decisions around the Black community, we may treat that community as a monolith. We may treat the South Asian community as a monolith. We may treat the Asian community as a monolith. But the advantage of having somebody at the table there who's from those communities, like, this is just the beginning to me, is that we just get a better sense of understanding those communities in ways in which we probably don't understand them already in some of those leadership tables. And so therefore the more the better we understand those communities, the better choices we can make, the better decisions we can make. I will say, hey, if you want to go talk to someone from the African community, I might not be the right person because I'm not African in the sense of, where I was born. Of course, I'm a descendant of Africa, like almost all Black people, but I do know that I could point them in the right direction because I know the community enough and know the nuance of the community enough that we can actually get what we need. And so that's the value of having people at the table. Have we seen a difference over the years? Not enough yet, but we've seen enough to know that I'm very hopeful that we're going to get there. But the value in it, of course, is the value in it that we actually get a better understanding of communities in ways we probably didn't, which means we could have a better job of marketing those communities, or in my case, getting them to experience our stories and to consume our content in ways, because they know that someone's at the table understands that, all Black people don't like reggae music. You know what I mean? Like, we actually like other things too. Like, we like rock and roll. We like all kinds of different things. Right. But I know that. And so I will make sure that when we're talking about it at the table, when we're making our story choices and decisions and the things that we want to focus on, that I have understand that. But with no representation at the table, I'm worried that sometimes we don't understand that. So those presentations that we made, it's great that we share those with as many people as possible so people understand the diversity within those communities. But then it's really important that you say, well, then how do we hire and bring in the right people to do the right things? Well, just start by hiring a person from that community to begin with, because they may be able to lead you down the road to figuring out what you need to do, because we understand our communities at least a little bit better than the people who aren't from our communities. It doesn't mean we understand them wholly 100%, but we understand them a little bit better, and we can at least get us going in the right direction. But yeah, we changed. We're changing. It's slow. I work in a corporation, so I understand slow, and it's not always fun, but at least I'm hopeful. And I just think that we need to do a better job, though, of making sure that we understand the value of that diversity at the decision-making table, at the beginning of the stage, not after we decide to make a product, and then we're going to bring in the South Asian or the Chinese consultant to talk about after we've already made a decision. No, way before, when we're even thinking about what it is we want to do, these people need to be at the table so that we can help frame and give us better choices and better opportunities.
Megha, your thoughts?
Look, I think Jagdeesh, Maz, and Nicholas have already addressed this, but seniority in leadership is important. Maybe I can shed some light not only from us targeting an audience, but in employment, right? So when you think about your workforce and your task force, if you're not having representation in your leadership, then you're not hitting diversity in a meaningful way, because that intern at the back of the room isn't going to tell you that, look, Kendall Jenner can't end a war with a Pepsi can. Someone who has a seat at the table is going to show up and be like, this is a bad idea and a PR disaster. Don't do it. And I think if you don't have those people at the table, even if half of your population is diverse, but that representation isn't reflected in people with positions of seniority, it's not going to make a meaningful impact in any way.
Tara, do you have any thoughts on this?
So as an Indigenous person who's not represented in any of those slides, and thank you for the land acknowledgement, Karim, I appreciate it. I feel like having a voice, similar to what Nikki was saying, is better than having no voice or having people speak for you, right? Or, come to you after the fact and say, hey, we're going to do this. It's important that we're included at the table and, not just as a performative task or, a check mark on a box. Oh, the Indigenous person's here, the Chinese person's here, we have a Black representative, we're good, right? But actually having a voice at the outset. And, I know from experience, I've been there and, you get to the event and there's the TP, in the display and you're like, wow, that's a TP from IKEA. And, you speak up and you say, that shouldn't be here. That's really offensive. And they're like, okay, cool. And they don't do anything about it. But then, someone else complains and it gets taken down. So, you have to weigh how much your voice is actually, how do I want to say, how much of a voice do you have? And, and I think like Nikki was saying, we're getting there. It's, it's moving, but it's moving slow, right?
If I can stay with you for a moment, Tara,
Sure.
How do we be better at this? Yeah, I guess that's the question. How can we be better at this? How can we ensure that we're not putting TPs for the sake of checking a box, but we're actually making meaningful things happen, having meaningful discussions?
So as an Indigenous person, I think we work at the speed of trust with community, and that takes time, right? And, historically, there's not a lot of trust. And, it takes time. We have to build rapport. We have to build that. I don't feel like you're using me as a token. I don't feel like I'm just sitting here as that, performative person on your checkbox, right? And so that has to be a trust, whether it's with your senior leadership or with your DEI community or with your working group, right? And so, I think that comes, right? And, at Google, we have an employee resource group for every community, Pride at, the Asian community, the Indus community, the Indigenous community, and that's where people can find community. And it's not just for the people that belong to that community, like as an Indigenous person or a trans person, but allyship. And that's where a lot of that trust gets built up internally and in product inclusion and in internal efforts, social responsibility. And I think that's where a lot of that trust gets built up. And that's where we start to move forward, I think. At least that seems to be what's working for us.
Can I add something there?
Yeah, go ahead.
I think Tara said something that was really, really important around when you say, how do we do better? That was the question you asked. I think what she was talking about was when you're at the table, it's about not just being invited to the table, but what does real inclusion mean? And her example of like, if I'm an Indigenous person and I'm telling you because I'm on leadership committee, on the leadership team, and if I actually have a voice and I'm empowered to actually exercise that voice, and I tell you that TP is a bad idea and you don't do it, well, that's not inclusion. like inclusion is that I trust what this person says. They're here because I want to leverage their expertise and their lived experience. And when they give me some advice or give me some feedback, I'm taking it very seriously. And I've been in situations, Tara, where you're right, where people of color have given us guidance before something has happened to not do something. We've ignored that guidance. And then we get our audience, rebels against us, and we get all this kind of negative publicity, negative feedback. It just happened within 2 weeks ago. I can tell you a story that happened in Edmonton. And we had the expertise at the table. Like there's a senior reporter who lives in that shop who saw what they're doing and said, no, this is a bad idea. We should not do this, and was ignored. And I had to go, okay, well, why would we not listen to her? Like, why are you calling me in Toronto because somehow my word is more important than hers. And she lives right there in Edmonton. She's a senior leader on your team. She gave you advice, because I'm giving you no different advice, but now you're giving it to you after the fact, after we've been, really just killed in the media about our coverage of a particular situation, when you had the expertise at the table. So that's not inclusion to me. Like, you actually don't respect her voice. You don't actually, she's been at CBC for 8 years. Like, it's not some new, fresh person. And she feels like she's not part of the leadership group. And now that person's going to leave our company. She has already made it clear to me she's leaving over that incident, because she's like, what am I here for? Like, when I have something to offer and I'm not even, there's not enough, as you said, respect or trust. You don't trust my judgment or respect me enough to accept my values. So to me, it's so important that you're right. We're not just hiring people so we can say we hired an Indigenous person on the leadership team, or we have to make it an inclusive process where their voice and their whatever they have to offer is not only respected, but it's valued, and that we trust their judgment and we accept what they're doing. And until we get there, like I don't want to be a token on some leadership board either. Like, if I tell you, as a Black man, that that's a pretty bad decision, and I'm going to give you some very logical reasons why, you should accept that and move on and not do it. And we didn't do it in Edmonton. We paid a dear price for it in terms of impacting our own credibility within that Black community in Edmonton. And when we had the expertise right there, we just didn't leverage it. We didn't use it.
And just, sorry, if I can jump in to add to that, I think the critical part of that story, Nicholas, is also that the person who's not diverse, but at the table, how do we ensure that they're listening, right? Because this, to me, is a failure of listening. So that person raised their voice, they have their seniority, but what can we do to ensure that everyone else is listening? And I think conversations like this are so important, because we're raising personal experiences about, like, hey, this person failed to listen to me. And hopefully people in senior positions who are on the call can kind of take note and be like, look, if something is brought up to me, I really should keep an open ear and be able to respond in a way that will, say, be a PR disaster, or someone leaving my company because of that situation.
There's a lot of thread that I can just continue to pull and pull and pull. I do want to recognize that we are up against the clock, and maybe I've got a couple of more questions. But before I move on to everybody who is participating and listening, continue this conversation when this session is over. The IAB does have a Slack channel that we can continue this. Have these discussions, please, in your offices, in your homes, and in your communities. This is not an issue that gets taken care of in 1 hour because of one session. So I encourage you all to continue this wherever you are. Megha, I want to go to you on this one. You helped the IAB create the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Charter. Tell me, are we there yet? Will we get to wherever that place is that we need to be as a community?
So honestly, I don't think so. And I think one of the most interesting parts about this data is really that we talked about groups and subgroups, right? Mm-hmm. And I think what we're not doing enough is addressing the macro group as it is before we can even jump into the subgroups. I think from personal experience, if I see someone of diversity being represented, whether it's at my company or whether it's, in an ad, I'm rooting them on irrespective of what background they are, because I'm like ecstatic. I'm like, yes, I see this. I'm so excited about this. So I think we haven't done enough to address the macro level subgroups, macro level groups, before we can even get into the subgroups of, what does it really mean to be South Asian? And within that bucket of South Asian, there's so many sub buckets for us to be addressed to. But until we can really avoid incidents like the one that Nicholas talked about, we're not there yet.
Mm-hmm. Nikki, Tara, and Megha, let's wrap it up with maybe a thought on where you hope we get to next as I guess as an industry and as a community. Nikki, if you don't mind, we can start off with you.
Yeah, no, thank you. Where do I hope we get to? Well, for me, it was shown in the presentations that we saw earlier, and I thought it was shown in the conversation that you had with Jagdeesh. And I think for me, with Jagdeesh, and for me, the thing is, can we get to a place where we're not just thinking about these communities during specific months or festivals or whatever?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I mean, I think it was such a really good point that people don't like. I don't buy cars only in Black History Month. So please don't just market to me cars for during Black History Month. Like, that's not the only time. And I'm sure it's the same for Indigenous people. I'm sure it's the same for South Asian people. Like we're part of society every day. And I think, I mean, when you think about the way in which our groups intersect with Western culture and colonialistic culture, like in terms of our celebrating Christmas, look how many people in our group celebrate Christmas and celebrate those traditions. Well, you know what? It'd be really nice to know we get to a point where people celebrate our traditions as well, but not just celebrate us during this particular month. I know most Black people who do this work that I do make a ton of money in February and make no money the rest of the year. But the information is just as valuable the rest of the year. Like, so why are we only doing that? It's like that comment about we only sell, we sell way more products to people from cultural groups during their cultural whatever months or celebrations or whatever. Well, that's because that's the only time you're marketing to them. Like, it only makes sense. Like, if I'm only marketing to them during this time, well, when else would they be even aware that I have product or content that they can consume if that's the only time I'm marketing to them? So we need to do a better job. So for me, I'd love to get to a state where we're thinking about these things in every decision we make at every time of the year, all the time, and thinking about how are we making sure our decisions and our choices are more inclusive always, not during particular times of month. And I do want you to put a bright light around Indigenous Heritage Month. I do want you to put a bright light around the wall. I still think we need to, just like we put a bright light around Christmas and around Easter and around Thanksgiving. I still want those bright lights, but I also want acknowledgement that, we're thinking about, we're being inclusive in all our choices from the moment we make a choice about something, regardless of what month it is or what time of the year or what festival is happening. And so when we get there, and we're not there yet in my world, and when we get there, that'd be great. That's what I'm hoping for. Yeah.
Well said, Nikki. Megha?
I went to a really interesting event this weekend. It was a women in leadership event, and the keynote speaker was one in 11 people in the world living with a rare disease, and she's the eldest. And she said something that was really profound, was that at the end of the day, humans overcomplicate things, and we're just looking to connect. And I think that applies to this conversation as well, right? If you can connect to the individual you're trying to reach, whether it's your target audience or whether it's your workforce, if you can establish that connection, then you're going to be able to create meaningful impact. And ultimately, I think connection is the most important part of this.
Well said. Tara, you want to wrap it up for us?
It's so hard to follow these two. They're so good at encapsulating everything. I guess, for speaking specifically to Indigenous people, because that's what I know, and going back to what Nikki said, we're not a monolith either, right? I think someone said to me, why don't you just all get together and do something? And I'm like, we're 600 different communities. It's like saying, why doesn't Europe just do this? We're not the same. We're all different. We all speak different languages. We have different customs. We're not the same. And so I think for Indigenous people, it's just not being on the periphery all the time. We get left out of a lot of conversations, right? And so, but we're almost 5% of the Canadian population. So I'd like to see us not, always be, remembered for all this trauma and the residential schools and the missing and murdered Indigenous women. We have a lot to celebrate, and we have a lot to be proud of. And so I think we need to counterbalance those two things. And 5% of the population is significant, and we shouldn't always be on the periphery. So I'd like to see that inclusion part more, and celebratory events. And we can get past all that bad stuff probably, and be celebrated as part of Canadian culture. So that's what I'd like to see.
Wonderful. Nikki, Megha, Tara, thank you so much for this discussion. I've really appreciated it.
Great.
Likewise, I feel so privileged to have heard all of your perspectives. Thank you so much. And let's do more. We want to do more. We need you to do this. So please get involved, reach out, carry on the conversation within our Slack channel, carry on the conversation, as you alluded, Karim, within your teams, within your friendship, everywhere. Let's just carry on the conversation. IAB Canada just closed our DEI survey. We look forward to sharing those results with industry very soon. And let's stay connected. Let's get connected. Thank you for tuning in today. It's really important to have you all here. We hope that you found this conversation extremely valuable. Before we conclude, I would just like to once again thank our incredible elite sponsors, Amazon Ads, Google Index Exchange, Quadcast, Samsung Ads, and the Globe and Mail. Let's do this again very, very soon. Thank you very much. Bye all.